Well, hey, Cascade Church, my name's Tim, I'm your pastor, and let's look at what we've been reading in the Bible this past week. We're in the middle of the book of Job, which is a story about suffering, and a theological term is called theodicy. It's a question of where is God in the middle of suffering. It's very timely. Right now there is so much going on in our world. We just have to tune in to see what's happened in Haiti. Right now, daily, we're hearing terrible stories of what's happening in Afghanistan. And those just highlight how things have been going around the world for a lot of people. And even in our own community, just had a funeral yesterday for Jackie. It was a wonderful time with the family, but so many tears. She's going to be so dearly missed. And the question of the book of Job is, why do we suffer? And when we do, where's God? And reading the book this time, one of the things that's getting me is the advisors don't have terrible theology. They just have terrible discernment and insight. And so they talk about God and how God is high and lifted up, how people, sometimes we suffer because of our sin. But what their mistake is, they're drawing conclusions that they have no evidence for. What they're trying to say is that Job's specific sin is leading to the suffering he's going through. And that is nowhere in the story, and it's not in the Bible. It's never that you say a bad word and then you stub your toe, or you cheat on your wife and then you lose your job. God doesn't play tit for tat like that. What we see instead is that there is a way of living that brings us closer to God, which also brings about blessing. God created us to live in this abundant, more abundant life, as Jesus said. In the Garden of Eden, we had everything we needed: our relationship with God, relationships with others, relationships with ourselves. And we broke that by first Adam and Eve's willful sin, but also our own. So Job is in this context where people do suffer because of their sins, but also we suffer because we're part of two things going on. The world is in chaos. It says in 1 Corinthians that the whole world is groaning. This might be Romans, I apologize. The whole world is groaning, waiting for redemption. And that means everything around us, the earthquake in Haiti, the coronavirus, those aren't necessarily specific sins, although we could maybe look into the foundings of Corona. They're doing investigations, but earthquakes are safer. It's not that somebody sinned and there was an earthquake. But we are in a broken world. On top of all that, we have a God who is so wise, and he uses suffering, he allows it, although he doesn't implement it, for the redemption of humanity. And so he has plans that we can't ever understand. There's a philosopher at Notre Dame University named Cornelius Plantinga. He talks about camping in the Midwest. And you get these little bugs called no-see-ums or chiggers, or just little things you can't see, but you see the evidence of them. So if you go to bed and you've got those in your tent or in your sleeping bag, you wake up and you're covered in bites. And what he says is, if there was an elephant in your tent, you'd obviously know. But if there's these no-see-ums, these chiggers in your tent, you would have no idea, but you would see the evidence of it. And so God chooses sometimes to show up in our lives more like those no-see-ums than an elephant. If God was just there like an elephant in the middle of our sufferings, we could point and see, oh, that's exactly what you're doing. But calling us to faith and realizing that God has wisdom, he shows up sometimes in ways we don't understand. And so we can never prove that there's no reason for suffering. Sometimes we're just called to be quiet and trust. John Calvin said that when the Bible speaks, we should speak. When the Bible's silent, we should be silent. And so even though Job's counselors understand things about God's sovereignty, God's holiness, personal responsibility, they didn't see the elephant. They didn't see the evidence of exactly how it was relating to Job, so they should have just said, yes, this is suffering. Yes, God is good, and we're with you. But they had to try to get preachy, and as a preacher, I get how that is. Even heard someone around the funeral saying, sometimes we just don't need words. Sometimes all we can bring is our tears. And I think that relates really well with what we're studying in 1 Corinthians also, because 1 Corinthians, he's been dealing with their sin, but at the very end, he talks about the most important hope we have, which is the resurrection of Jesus. He says that if Jesus is not resurrected, then everything we believe is in vain. Being a Christian is completely useless if Jesus didn't rise from the dead. And that's important to remember. Right now, there's a lot of circles, even pastors and churches, that don't believe that Jesus actually rose from the dead. They believe that we have a feeling of resurrection, that the resurrection is the sense of hope, even in the middle of catastrophe. But according to the Bible, Jesus actually did rise from the dead. And yes, we do have feelings of hope. Yes, there is a resurrection spirit in the world because of Jesus, but all that comes to the fact that there was a body, a physical body that was beaten and crucified, that was in a tomb, and then got back up. The stone was rolled away, it was pushed away. Jesus ate fish, he touched his disciples, Thomas touched him. So he had a real body. And that's so important. We can spend hours giving you evidence for that. I recommend The Case for Christ by Lee Strobel, Evidence That Demands a Verdict. N.T. Wright has a good book on the resurrection. All very important things that prove it happened in history, and that's the foundation of our faith. But that's not where Paul stops. To these people in Corinth who were rebellious and having a tough time with their own morality, he says, because Jesus rose from the dead, we will also. So after we die, we get resurrection bodies. We get new bodies. Heaven is not going to be this intangible angels floating on clouds playing harps thing. There's going to be a new garden. There's going to be new physical bodies. There's going to be new food. It's going to be a physical experience. And so all that gives us hope. And so right today, in this morning's reading, Job said that he knew his Redeemer lived. And in the earth he will see him. Later in the book he'll say, in my flesh I will see him. And Job is hinting at what Paul is talking about, that Jesus came and he was our Redeemer and he was in the flesh on the earth. But someday in our flesh, in our resurrected bodies, we will see him in his resurrected body, and that will conclude everything. And so that's what the main things that have stuck out for me this week. As always, if you have any questions, please let me know. I'd be happy to have a conversation with you or deal with it. There's an email that goes along with this that has a ton of links for evidence about the resurrection. I didn't get to it on this video, but in 1 Corinthians 14, they talk about the gift of tongues, the gift of prophecy. I've been a part of charismatic churches, so I know how exciting and confusing that all can be. So if you have any questions about any of that, please let me know. All right, God bless.